Boise, Idaho, July 15, 2007. The kind of bright summer morning that parents dream about and children live for. The kind of morning that makes you believe the world is safe. Birds sang in the crisp mountain air. Sprinklers ticked across freshly cut lawns. Children laughed in backyards, their voices carrying on a breeze scented faintly of pine. To anyone driving through the quiet Hillcrest neighborhood, it looked like a picture of suburban innocence. But by nightfall, one family's life would be shattered forever, and a small American town would begin a 12-year descent into a nightmare of unanswered questions. If you think your neighborhood is safe, if you think tragedy only happens somewhere else, stay with me. Because this story will change the way you look at every child riding a bike down your street. Emily Carter was 10 years old, and like most 10-year-olds, she lived for the freedom of summer. That morning she finished her bowl of Lucky Charms, the rainbow-tinted milk left behind on the counter where her mother Sarah would later find it untouched, warmed by hours of waiting. Emily's pink Huffy bicycle waited for her on the porch, handlebar streamers swaying in the breeze, bell ready to chime with each pedal stroke. She'd been given new freedom that summer, permission to ride within clearly marked boundaries. 3 blocks north to Veterans Park, 2 blocks south to the corner market, but never past the railroad tracks, the line her parents described as a wall between safety and the unknown. From the kitchen window, Sarah Carter watched her daughter adjust the purple helmet decorated with butterfly stickers. It was already warm, but Emily insisted on wearing it. She was independent that way. The kind of child who left notes on the fridge about where she was going. The kind of child who waved at elderly neighbors and remembered to call when she'd be late. On that morning her note, written carefully in cursive, read simply, "Gone to ride bikes with Madison. Back before lunch, love, M." That note would stay pinned to the refrigerator for years, a cruel reminder of plans that were never completed. Her father, David, was outside mowing the lawn, the hum of the machine blending into the neighborhood's Saturday soundtrack. Neighbors watered gardens. A woman on a porch swing waved as Emily pedaled away, her blonde pigtails streaming behind her like ribbons of joy. Everything looked so normal that later investigators would replay the details over and over, searching for the exact moment when normal ended and nightmare began. At first there was nothing unusual about Emily not being home right at noon. She was a punctual child, but kids lose track of time. Sarah glanced at the clock a few times, starting to feel a mother's unease. By 12:30, Emily's friend Madison knocked on the door asking if Emily could play. She hadn't seen her all morning. Jessica Walsh came shortly after with the same question. Both girls assumed Emily had gone elsewhere. That was the moment Sarah felt a shiver of fear, one she tried to push aside but couldn't ignore. By 2:47 p.m., Officer Michael Sullivan, just 2 years into his service, was called to Maple Street, 3 blocks in the opposite direction of Emily's intended route. There, leaning against a fire hydrant, stood the pink Huffy bicycle, its training wheels caked in fresh mud despite the dry July weather. Its bell, usually bright with sound, hung silent. A small backpack still dangled from the handlebars, containing a juice box, 2 granola bars, and a purple notebook. On its first page in careful letters, Emily had written, "Today will be the best day ever." That notebook became evidence, that phrase haunting. Detective Janet Morrison, transferred from Portland just months earlier, was assigned to lead the investigation. It was the kind of case that transforms careers and scars lives. She spread maps across the conference table, red pins marking witness reports. At 9:00 a.m., Mrs. Rodriguez recalled Emily riding by waving cheerfully. At 9:10, security footage at Miller's Corner store captured Emily walking her bike, glancing over her shoulder as if following someone just out of frame. At 9:30, a teenager named Marcus Thompson saw her stopped at the corner of Maple and Pine, talking to someone in a dark sedan. He felt uneasy but dismissed it. That single choice, to say nothing, would haunt him for years. Search dogs arrived the next morning, tracing Emily's scent with precision from her house to Maple Street. And then, nothing. The trail ended cold at the fire hydrant, as if she had been lifted off the earth. Dogs circled. Their handler, a veteran of 20 years, muttered words no one forgot. Scent trails don't just vanish. Something happened here. And with that, the search transformed from hopeful to desperate. The Roosevelt Elementary Gymnasium turned into command central. Tables stacked with maps, radios crackling, volunteers streaming in by the hundreds, parents, teachers, retirees, teenagers, a community refusing to accept the unthinkable. They combed drainage ditches, abandoned buildings, and cottonwood groves along the river. Helicopters roared overhead. The July heat pressed down like punishment, but still they searched. Because somewhere, they believed, Emily was waiting. Sarah worked the phones at the command center, logging every tip, building timelines, clinging to organization as if it could conjure order from chaos. David walked with search teams, shouting Emily's name until his voice broke, then whispering it like a prayer. Other fathers walked beside him, united by fear that their own families could shatter next. Each hour that passed cut the odds of Emily's survival. But no one dared speak the math aloud. Detective Morrison questioned classmates gently. One said Emily had seemed excited about a secret on Friday. Another recalled she'd spoken of a surprise. Children's memories proved fragile, unreliable, yet heavy with possibility. Investigators reviewed every registered sex offender within 50 miles. All cleared. They checked financials, phone records, internet history. Nothing. Emily was exactly who she seemed, a normal girl who disappeared abnormally. By the third week, hope withered. Volunteers drifted back to their lives. News crews packed their vans. Boys settled into uneasy silence, carrying the wound of a missing child that never healed. Sarah returned to her library job, moving through days like a ghost. David boxed away Emily's helmet, unable to see it without breaking. Detective Morrison stayed late at her desk every Friday, reviewing the thickening case file like a ritual, haunted by details that led nowhere. Years passed. Leads fizzled. Rumors swirled. A sighting in Portland. Clothing in Nevada. Each time, the Carters' hearts broke again when evidence proved false. Their marriage dissolved under the weight of grief, quietly, without accusation. Sarah stayed in the family home. David moved to Portland, chasing distance from pain. But every July 15th, Sarah organized a vigil in Veterans Park. Candles flickered. Photographs smiled. Prayers rose. The crowd thinned each year. But Sarah refused to let her daughter's memory fade. By 2019, Emily's case had become legend in Boise. New families moved in, told by neighbors about the girl who vanished. Children grew up hearing her story as a warning. And then, by chance, demolition crews at the abandoned Whitman property unearthed a buried steel container wrapped in plastic and duct tape. Inside were 43 Polaroid photographs. And Emily's eyes stared back. What those photographs revealed would shatter Boise all over again. Because Emily Carter had not vanished into nothing. She had been stolen, hidden, documented in ways that defied imagination. And the person responsible had been living quietly among them, a trusted face, a neighbor in plain sight. The discovery of the metal box changed everything. For 12 years investigators had worked with nothing. No DNA, no witnesses, no trace. And suddenly, buried in the dirt behind a crumbling property, sat proof that Emily Carter's story had not simply evaporated into thin air. The container was lifted carefully, wrapped, and transported to the Idaho State Police Crime Lab. Detectives braced themselves for disappointment. After so many false starts, no one dared hope too loudly. But when the padlock was cut and the lid pried open, the horror revealed inside sent ripples through every person in that sterile lab. Inside, wrapped with obsessive precision in layers of plastic and acid-free paper, were 43 Polaroid photographs. Primitive by today's digital standards, but preserved with such care that the colors were still sharp, the details crisp. And in those photographs was Emily Carter, her small face frozen across a sequence of images that documented not just her final moments, but the systematic cruelty of someone who had planned everything. The first photographs showed her frightened but alive. Others depicted a progression too terrible to describe fully, each frame a chronicle of terror. Investigators turned away, some leaving the room to collect themselves. Even seasoned crime scene technicians struggled to continue. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, senior forensic examiner, steadied her voice as she dictated notes. Each photo was catalogued, bagged, and scanned. What horrified her most wasn't just what was done to Emily, but how carefully the documentation had been preserved. This was not impulsive violence, it was ritual. It was evidence collected by the perpetrator himself, almost like trophies meant to be revisited. Whoever had taken these photographs had intended them to survive, intended them to be found, or feared they might someday be found. Detective Kevin Sullivan watched through the glass, fighting the sickness in his gut. For years, Emily Carter's case had been his shadow. Now, at last, he had something concrete. The photographs proved Emily had been abducted, held, and murdered. But they also provided something else: clues. In the background of several images, details emerged: pieces of furniture, wall paneling, a calendar, even a reflection in a mirror. For the first time, there was a path forward. The FBI was called in immediately. Rebecca Martinez, a digital evidence specialist, flew in with high-tech equipment. Each photograph was scanned at maximum resolution. Shadows were enhanced, pixels dissected, contrast adjusted. The human eye could miss details. Computers could resurrect them. In photo number 17, a calendar hung on the wall. Enhancement revealed handwritten notes. More importantly, the calendar was open to July 2007, the exact month Emily vanished. That single image confirmed what detectives had suspected but never proven. The photographs were taken during the week she disappeared. Other details emerged. Distinctive wood paneling, likely from homes built in the 1940s or 50s. A specific style of basement window. A utility bill lying on a table, partially visible, its address blurred but not erased. In photo number 29, the enhancement revealed something no one expected: a reflection in a mirror. It showed the photographer's hand, wearing a ring and a watch. And more telling, the sleeve of a uniform shirt, the kind often worn by maintenance or custodial staff. A badge or ID card dangled from a lanyard. The text was unreadable, but the shape was unmistakable. Piece by piece, investigators reconstructed a profile. The perpetrator lived locally, in Boise. He had access to a basement that matched the architecture. He worked in an institutional setting, likely a school. He was methodical, cautious, and patient. And he had kept trophies for 12 years. The list of possibilities shrank from thousands to dozens. Property records identified 47 homes in the target neighborhood, built in the right era with the right basement features. Cross-referencing those with school district employment records from 2007 led to a chilling name: Thomas Weber. 54 years old, longtime custodial worker for the Boise School District and resident of Elm Street, just 6 blocks from Maple, where Emily's bike had been found. His house matched the architecture, and his basement matched the windows, and his job explained the uniform. On paper, Weber was the perfect employee. No criminal record, commendations for reliability. A neighbor who shoveled snow for the elderly. The kind of man parents trusted without thinking. Surveillance began quietly in April 2019. Detectives watched Weber leave his modest ranch house at exactly 60 a.m. and watched him return at 40:15 p.m. Grocery trips on Saturdays. Nothing unusual, too normal, almost rehearsed. But when a warrant was obtained and his basement searched, the facade crumbled. The basement still bore the distinctive wood paneling seen in the photographs. Luminol revealed faint blood spatter painted over years earlier. In cracks between floorboards, strands of blonde hair were recovered. DNA confirmed them as Emily Carter's. Behind a false wall, investigators uncovered more photographs, computer equipment, and belongings that once belonged to Emily. And not just Emily, items linked to at least 3 other missing children from across Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. The arrest came at Roosevelt Elementary School on April 8, 2019. Weber was on his knees installing flooring in a classroom. Children played outside at recess, unaware that the quiet janitor among them was being handcuffed for some of the most horrific crimes their community had ever known. Detective Sullivan personally read the charges. Weber simply asked to call his attorney, his voice calm, as if this too was routine. That calmness chilled everyone in the room. The news hit Boise like an earthquake. Parents who had trusted the school system now learned that Emily's killer had worked inside classrooms for over a decade after her disappearance. The memorial garden at Roosevelt Elementary, planted for Emily, had been tended by the very man who murdered her. At the police station, confronted with photographs, DNA, and forensic evidence, Weber maintained silence at first. But after hours of questioning, faced with proof he could not deny, he confessed. not with drama or emotion, but with monotone detachment. Emily had not died quickly. He had held her in his basement for 6 days. During the day he went to work at the school, maintaining his routine. At night he returned to Emily, documenting her suffering with Polaroids. He referred to them as experiments. Investigators could barely stomach the details. And then, almost casually, he revealed more. Emily had not been his only victim. Jennifer Martinez, age 9, Portland, 2005. Michael Thompson, age 8, Kirkland, 2008. Ashley Rodriguez, age 10, Spokane, 2011. Each had vanished, their cases unsolved, their families left in limbo. Weber described them with the same monotone calm, as if listing tasks completed at work. For investigators, it was both the breakthrough they had dreamed of and the nightmare they dreaded. Weeks of searching his house revealed hidden compartments filled with trophies, toys, clothing, notebooks, locks of hair, each item catalogued, each linked to a child who had never come home. The scope of Weber's crimes extended far beyond boys. He had been a predator operating in plain sight for years, shielded by his ordinary appearance and trusted position. For Sarah and David Carter, the confession was both resolution and devastation. For 12 years they had prayed for answers. Now they had them. But the truth was worse than their darkest fears. Sarah sat in court every day of the trial, clutching Emily's photograph. David flew in from Portland for the sentencing, the first time he and Sarah had been in the same room in years. Their marriage had collapsed under grief, but in that courtroom they stood united, facing the man who had destroyed their lives. The community reeled. Parents struggled with the realization that their children had spent years in daily contact with a man capable of unspeakable cruelty. The school district implemented sweeping changes. New background checks, psychological evaluations, stricter hiring protocols. But no policy could erase the fact that for 12 years, the monster had walked their hallways. Weber received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Some said it wasn't enough. Others said no punishment could ever match his crimes. For Detective Sullivan, watching Weber loaded into a prison transport van brought a hollow sense of closure. Emily Carter was coming home. But not as the vibrant child on her pink bicycle. She was coming home as evidence, as photographs, as testimony. For boys, the case left scars deeper than anyone expected. The illusion of safety was gone. Neighbors locked doors earlier. Parents clutched their children tighter. And every July, candles still flickered in Veterans Park, not just for Emily, but for the innocence that vanished with her. The trial of Thomas Weber was unlike anything boys had ever seen. The courtroom overflowed with reporters, parents, and community members who still remembered the missing posters that once plastered every lamppost in town. For Sarah Carter, the trial was the culmination of 12 years of searching, praying, bargaining, and breaking. She sat in the front row every day, Emily's school photograph framed in her hands, the same picture she had shown to neighbors on that frantic July afternoon in 2007. David Carter sat beside her during the sentencing phase. The first time in years they shared the same space. Their marriage had ended under the relentless strain of grief. But Emily's memory united them once more. Weber entered the courtroom in shackles, his expression flat, his posture rigid. The same quiet demeanor that had allowed him to move unnoticed through schools and neighborhoods for decades. For the families watching, it was unbearable to reconcile this mild-looking man with the monstrous crimes he had confessed to. Some expected remorse. Others expected rage. Instead, they were met with calm detachment, as if Weber was a spectator at his own trial. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: the photographs, the DNA, the trophies hidden in his basement, and Weber's own recorded confessions. Each piece of evidence struck like a hammer, leaving the defense scrambling for technicalities that never stood a chance. Jurors wept openly as the photographs were described, those spared from the worst of what they depicted. Dr. Hoffman testified about the preservation methods, her voice steady but eyes clouded with pain. Detective Sullivan recounted the years he had carried Emily's case, the Friday nights spent combing through files, the day the box was unearthed, the moment Weber confessed. His testimony was not just professional but deeply personal. Emily's case had become the defining shadow of his career, and now he finally spoke the truth aloud in a courtroom that demanded to hear it. Weber's attorneys offered little in his defense. They suggested mental illness, compulsion, trauma from childhood. But the jury saw through it. What Weber had done was not impulsive, not uncontrolled, it was meticulous, planned, documented, preserved. This was not madness, it was cruelty sharpened into precision. When the verdict came, it was unanimous. Guilty on all counts: the abduction, assault, and murder of Emily Carter, along with charges tied to other identified victims. The sentence was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For some, it was relief. For others, it was a bitter reminder that justice in this world is limited. No sentence could bring Emily back. No prison term could erase 12 years of grief or restore the childhood stolen from families across 3 states. As Weber was led from the courtroom, Sarah Carter did not cry. She sat motionless, Emily's photograph pressed to her chest, her face a mask of exhaustion and survival. Later, when reporters asked what she felt, she said only this: "My daughter is not a story. She was a child. And I will make sure she is remembered as a child, not as a victim." The aftermath rippled through Boise in ways that were both immediate and enduring. Parents who had once allowed their children to ride bikes freely now walk beside them, holding tight. The school district faced public outrage, accused of failing to detect the monster working in its halls. New protocols were instituted: enhanced background checks, psychological screenings, stricter oversight. But for many families, the trust had been broken beyond repair. The very institution meant to safeguard their children had unknowingly harbored a predator. That wound would take decades to heal. The Carter family struggled with closure. Sarah continued to live in the same house, the refrigerator still bearing Emily's final handwritten note. She turned her pain into advocacy, working with missing children's organizations, speaking at schools about safety, demanding policy reforms that might prevent another family from living her nightmare. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had endured the worst and survived, though survival itself sometimes felt like punishment. David Carter found his own path to healing. He remained in Portland, remarried eventually, but never stopped calling Sarah every July 15th. Their conversations were brief, practical, orbiting around the memorial vigil, but beneath the surface was a bond forged by unimaginable loss. They had been parents together, and though grief had separated them, it also kept them tethered to the memory of the daughter they once tucked into bed each night. Detective Kevin Sullivan retired 5 years later. He carried Emily's case like a scar, one that shaped his career and his life. At his retirement gathering, colleagues toasted his persistence, his refusal to give up when others had moved on. But Sullivan himself said little. He knew closure was a fragile concept. He had delivered answers, yes. But he had also witnessed the depths of human cruelty. And he knew that for every case solved, countless others remained, haunting other families, other communities. Emily Carter's legacy became more than a cautionary tale. Each July, Veterans Park filled with candles and photographs. Some years hundreds came, some years only a few. But always Sarah Carter stood at the center, her voice steady as she thanked volunteers, detectives, and strangers who refused to forget. Roosevelt Elementary built a permanent memorial garden, purple flowers, butterfly bushes, and a plaque that read, "In memory of Emily Carter, whose light continues to guide us." Children played near it daily, often unaware of the story behind it, but their laughter carried a strange kind of healing. On social media, Emily's case found new life. Thousands joined online groups dedicated to missing children, inspired by her story to push for awareness and vigilance. Amateur investigators dissected every detail, some critical of police, others praising the eventual resolution. The debates mattered less than the outcome. Emily Carter was not forgotten. She had become a symbol of why communities must remain vigilant, why silence can be dangerous, and why evil sometimes wears the mask of ordinary. Weber remained in prison, his appeals rejected, his name synonymous with betrayal. For years, journalists requested interviews, hoping to unlock his motives. He never granted them. Perhaps there were no answers that could satisfy. Perhaps silence was his final control. But it no longer mattered. His power was gone. His secrets were exposed. And Emily Carter's story had been wrested back from the shadows. In Boise, life moved forward as it must. Children grew up, new families moved in. The Hillcrest neighborhood regained its suburban rhythm. But beneath the surface lingered a collective memory, a caution that shaped choices and habits. Parents watched more closely, communities organized more tightly, and every child on a pink bicycle was a reminder of the one who never came home. Emily's story did not end in that basement, or in those photographs, or even in the courtroom. It lived on in the laws that changed, in the gardens planted, in the vigils held. It lived on in the parents who learned to listen to their instincts, to trust unease, to speak up when something felt wrong. And it lived on in the countless lives touched by the determination of one mother who refused to let her daughter vanish from memory. If you have listened this far, ask yourself, how can we protect the children around us? How can we build communities where predators cannot hide behind ordinary faces? Emily Carter's story is a tragedy, but it is also a call to action. Watch.
Listen, speak.
Because sometimes safety is only an illusion. And sometimes the smallest act of vigilance can mean the difference between a child who comes home and a child whose photograph is carried in candlelight. The container from the Whitman property was transported to the Idaho State Police Forensic Laboratory under armed escort, as though it carried not just evidence but the fragile hope of an entire community. The sterile corridors smelled faintly of disinfectant and ozone from sterilizing machines. Investigators moved with measured steps, their voices low, as if the air itself demanded reverence. For 12 years, Boise had lived in the shadow of Emily Carter's disappearance. Now, for the first time, the possibility of answers rested inside a battered steel box. Dr. Patricia Hoffman oversaw the evidence intake. She had processed homicides, assaults, and countless tragedies in her 2 decades of forensic work, but the moment she laid eyes on the duct-taped container, she felt a rare unease. It wasn't just the condition of the box, it was the precision of its concealment. Every layer of tape wrapped with care, every seam sealed against moisture. Whoever buried it had understood longevity, had anticipated discovery. This was not careless disposal, this was preservation. The first step was documentation. High-resolution photographs of the container from every angle, measurements of its dimensions, notations about the soil still clinging to its sides, the smell of mildew rising faintly as the plastic sheeting was cut away. Even the corrosion on the padlock was catalogued. Every detail mattered, because every detail might become the thread that unraveled the mystery. When the padlock finally gave way under bolt cutters, the sharp metallic snap echoed through the lab like a gunshot. Hoffman paused before opening the lid, her gloved hands steady despite the tension. Slowly the hinges groaned. Inside was not the skeletal remains investigators had braced for, but something in some ways far worse. Polaroid photographs. Dozens of them, wrapped carefully in archival tissue paper. Each one an image preserved not by accident but by intention. Technicians exchanged glances heavy with dread. One by one, the photographs were lifted, numbered, and placed into protective sleeves. Even through the protective barrier, the horror was unmistakable. Emily's face appeared in the first image, her eyes wide, her mouth drawn tight in fear. Other photographs followed, showing her in different stages, different poses, each frame an escalation of terror. The images documented not just her presence, but her suffering. Dr. Hoffman forced herself into clinical detachment, describing aloud what her mind screamed to reject. She noted the lighting consistent and deliberate. She recorded the condition of the film stock, recognizing Polaroid's 600 series manufactured between 2005 and 2008. She spoke into the recorder with the steady voice of science, even as her heart recoiled. What haunted her most was not just Emily's visible fear, but the artistry in the photographs. The person who took them had arranged objects deliberately, had adjusted angles and light. These were not spontaneous snapshots, they were compositions. And that meant intent. When the FBI's Rebecca Martinez arrived, she carried with her equipment that looked more suited to a NASA mission than a crime lab. High-resolution scanners, image enhancement software capable of pulling clarity from the faintest pixel. The photographs were digitized at resolutions that revealed details invisible to the naked eye. As each image appeared on the monitor, Martinez adjusted contrast, magnified corners, applied filters. Slowly, the backgrounds yielded secrets. In one image, a calendar hung on a wall. Enhanced, it revealed not just the month, July 2007, but handwritten notes, shifts, initials, times of day. The calendar was distinctive, sold regionally by a printing company that featured Idaho wildlife. That detail alone narrowed the geographic radius of investigation. Another photograph revealed a utility bill lying partially folded on a table. Under magnification, faint letters emerged, enough to confirm it was addressed to a boy's residence, though the street name remained incomplete. For investigators, it was like catching a glimpse of a shadow in the dark. Proof that the crime scene was not distant or abstract, but here, among them. But the most chilling revelation came from photograph number 29. At first glance, it showed only Emily in the foreground. But Martinez, studying the reflection in a mirror behind her, saw something. She enhanced the image repeatedly, pixel by pixel. And there it was, a man's hand, holding the camera, wearing a ring and a watch, the sleeve of a uniform shirt, and dangling from his chest, blurred but undeniable, the outline of an ID badge on a lanyard. The lab went silent. Investigators leaned forward, staring at the image as Martinez manipulated it. The text was unreadable, but the shape was clear. This was no stranger picked at random from the shadows. This was someone who worked in an environment that required identification. Likely a school, hospital, or government building. The thought that Emily's abductor had been trusted in such a setting made everyone's stomach turn. Cross-referencing began immediately. Boise property records were scoured for houses built in the 1940s and 50s, homes with basements featuring narrow windows and wood paneling like that visible in the photos. 47 such homes were identified in a 6-block radius near where Emily's bike had been discovered. From there, investigators looked at who had lived in those homes in 2007. At the same time, FBI analysts focused on the uniform. The fabric appeared industrial, the color scheme muted. It resembled maintenance or custodial clothing, not private sector attire. They cross-checked with Boise School District records, filtering for employees living within the identified radius. The list that emerged was chillingly short. Among them was Thomas Weber, a maintenance worker with 15 years of service. On paper, Weber was unremarkable, middle-aged, divorced, commendations for reliability, no criminal record. His personnel file painted him as a model employee, the kind of man trusted with keys to every classroom, every hallway. But his house on Elm Street matched the architectural features in the photographs. And his daily commute passed directly by the corner of Maple Street where Emily's bike had been found. As investigators pieced the puzzle together, the lab continued to extract every detail from the photographs. Furniture styles were cataloged, electrical outlets compared with regional building codes. Even dust patterns on the floor were analyzed. Each clue reinforced the same conclusion. Emily Carter had spent her final days in a basement that belonged to someone who lived and worked within the fabric of Boise's trust. Forensic teams tested every hair, every fiber, every speck of dust recovered from the container. Soil samples on the duct tape were matched to the exact type of clay found in the Whitman property yard. Fingerprints were lifted from the plastic wrapping, though partial and degraded. Even the handwriting on the calendar was analyzed, though inconclusive at the time. For the scientists, it was both exhilarating and devastating. Exhilarating because for the first time, the evidence pointed somewhere concrete. Devastating because of what the photographs revealed beyond identification. Emily's suffering was not brief. The timestamps implied days of captivity. The progression of her expressions, her clothing, even her hair, all told a story that words could barely contain. Technicians worked in shifts around the clock, driven by the unspoken urgency of giving Emily back her voice. Every enhancement, every analysis, every fragment was a step closer to unraveling a crime that had defined Boise for over a decade. And as each detail emerged, the circle around Thomas Weber grew tighter, until his anonymity could no longer shield him. When news of the buried photographs broke, Boise was thrust back into the nightmare it had tried to bury for 12 years. For years, Emily's name had been spoken in hushed tones, a story parents told new neighbors as a warning, a ghost that lingered in the background of suburban life. Now suddenly, she was everywhere again, on television screens, in headlines, in the whispered prayers of a community reliving its deepest wound. Satellite trucks lined the streets near Roosevelt Elementary. National anchors stood in front of the vigil site at Veterans Park, speaking words like breakthrough, horror, and justice into their microphones. Boise was no longer just a small city in Idaho. It had become the center of a true crime story that shocked the nation. The community's reaction was a mixture of relief, disbelief. Relief that Emily's fate was no longer a mystery. Disbelief that her killer had lived among them all along. And rage, pure, white-hot rage, that the man responsible had been allowed to work in schools, to sweep the hallways where children laughed, to water the very memorial garden planted in Emily's honor. Parents wept openly at the realization. Neighbors replayed memories of Thomas Weber, shy waves, polite nods, the man who had fixed a leaky pipe or shoveled snow without being asked. None of them had seen a monster. That was the hardest truth of all. Evil had worn the face of ordinary decency. For Sarah Carter, the revelation was both a relief and a fresh wound. For 12 years she had lived in limbo, torn between hope and despair. Now she had answers, but the answers were unbearable. The images from the container were not shown publicly. But she had been told what they contained. The knowledge alone was enough to fracture her sleep, to claw at her peace. Yet Sarah carried herself with a strange strength. At a press conference days after Weber's arrest, she stood before flashing cameras and said, "My daughter was not just a victim. She was a child who loved bikes and butterflies, who believed in kindness. Don't remember her for what he did. Remember her for who she was." Her words rippled through the crowd, a plea to preserve Emily's humanity amid the sensationalism. David Carter processed the truth differently. He had remarried by the time Weber was arrested, living a quieter life in Portland, but the call from Detective Sullivan shattered the fragile normalcy he had built. Flying back to Boise, he walked into a storm of cameras and microphones, struggling to find words. Where Sarah leaned into advocacy, David leaned into silence. He visited Emily's room for the first time in years, sat on her small bed, and wept into the butterfly, printed pillowcase still waiting for her. The Carters' grief was mirrored by countless families across Idaho and beyond. Parents sat their children down and told them about Emily's case for the first time, warning them that even familiar faces could hide danger. Schools across the region held assemblies about safety, stranger danger, reborn with a new urgency. Roosevelt Elementary, the very place where Weber had walked the halls daily, held a special gathering. Teachers cried as they spoke of Emily, as they admitted their shame that her killer had been among them. Students, many too young to remember 2007, left the assembly holding their parents' hands tighter than before. The media frenzy reached a fever pitch. True crime shows scrambled to produce specials. National newspapers dispatched investigative teams. Commentators debated how Weber had evaded detection for so long. Online forums exploded with theories, speculation, and criticism of law enforcement. Some praised Detective Morrison's and Sullivan's persistence. Others condemned the years of stagnation. Social media amplified every angle, sometimes with compassion, often with cruelty. Sarah tried to shield herself from the noise, but she could not avoid the constant reminders. Emily's face was everywhere again, not the smiling school photo she had pinned on her fridge, but the face of a national headline. Through it all, the vigil at Veterans Park grew larger than ever before. Thousands attended in the summer of 2019, candles flickering in the twilight, purple ribbons tied to trees. The park was filled with people who had never met Emily but felt bound to her story, bound to the injustice that had unfolded in their own backyard. Sarah stood at the podium, her voice trembling but resolute. "We are here not just for Emily, but for every child who didn't make it home. Let her light guide us to protect those still here." Her words turned grief into purpose, rallying a city around the fragile idea that remembrance could be a kind of justice. Detective Sullivan, though seasoned, felt the weight of community anger pressing against him. Reporters asked why Weber hadn't been caught sooner, why no one had connected the dots earlier. Sullivan gave measured answers, but privately he carried guilt. For years he had stared at maps, files, timelines, missing the truth that had lived 6 blocks away. Now, despite solving the case, he felt no victory. Only the ache of knowing Emily might have been saved if someone had seen the signs sooner. The forensic revelations only deepened the community's turmoil. The lab confirmed that the photographs had been meticulously preserved. The timestamps and background details proved Emily had been alive for days after her disappearance, held captive while Weber went about his daily routine. That detail alone broke the hearts of parents across Boise. The thought that she had been so close, trapped in a basement while search parties combed the city above, was unbearable. Volunteers who had searched in 2007 wept openly when told they had been so near but so far. In churches, prayers turned to lamentations. Pastors spoke of evil in human form, of vigilance, of resilience. Counselors reported an uptick in anxiety among children and parents alike. Boise was no longer naive. Its innocence had been stolen twice, first by Emily's disappearance, then by the revelation that her killer had been hiding in plain sight. David and Sarah's relationship during this period was fragile but significant. Though divorced, they leaned on each other in unexpected ways. Sarah admitted she could not attend some hearings without David beside her. David confessed he could not walk through Veterans Park without Sarah's hand gripping his. Their grief had once torn them apart, now it tethered them in uneasy companionship. They spoke often, carefully avoiding the blame that could destroy them again. Their conversations circled around Emily, around the unbearable truth, around the ways they could honor her memory even in their brokenness. Meanwhile, Weber sat in jail, awaiting trial. His calm demeanor unsettled guards and investigators alike. He read quietly, wrote little, spoke less. Journalists speculated endlessly about his motives, but no manifesto emerged. No dramatic explanation. He was ordinary, chillingly so. That ordinariness became part of the horror. The reminder that predators do not always look like villains. Sometimes they look like neighbors. As the trial date approached, Boise lived in suspended animation. Every headline, every rumor, every update about Weber reignited anger and sorrow. Yet beneath the turmoil, something else stirred, a collective determination. Parents organized neighborhood watches. Schools increased security. Civic groups formed networks to support families of missing children. Emily's story became not just a tragedy but a catalyst. Boise refused to let her name fade into despair. By the time the courtroom doors opened, the city was ready. Reporters filled the benches. Parents clutched each other's hands. Sarah and David sat side by side, Emily's photograph propped on the bench in front of them. Outside, crowds gathered with candles even in daylight, their voices rising in chants for justice. The trial was not just about one man and one child. It was about reclaiming a community's stolen sense of safety. And as testimony began, the city listened with the reverence of mourners and the vigilance of survivors. They would finally hear, piece by painful piece, how their summer of 2007 had turned into a 12-year nightmare. The trial of Thomas Weber opened on a cold January morning, the courthouse steps crowded with reporters, parents, and community members who had waited more than a decade for this moment. Television cameras broadcast the proceedings live to audiences far beyond Idaho, transforming a small town courtroom into the stage for one of the most harrowing cases in modern true crime history. The Carters arrived quietly, shielded by deputies, Sarah clutching the same framed school portrait of Emily that had accompanied her through every vigil and press conference. David walked beside her, his face drawn, his movements stiff with the weight of anticipation. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense, as though the walls themselves absorbed the collective grief and rage of the community. The jury filed in with solemn expressions, already burdened by the knowledge that they would be asked to confront horrors few people could imagine. When Weber was led in, shackled and dressed in a plain suit chosen by his defense attorneys, a murmur rippled through the room. He looked unremarkable, ordinary, even. That ordinariness unsettled the families watching. How could such cruelty hide behind such a face? The prosecution began with a devastating opening statement. The district attorney, a seasoned lawyer with a reputation for precision, stood before the jury and said, "This case is about a little girl who went for a bike ride and never came home. For 12 years, her parents asked where she was. Today we will show you who took her, how he hid her, and why Emily Carter never got to grow up." He gestured toward the evidence table where binders thick with photographs and reports sat waiting. The jurors leaned forward, bracing themselves for what they would endure in the weeks to come. The defense offered little in rebuttal. Their strategy was thin, built on suggestions of mental instability and circumstantial doubt. They admitted Weber had committed terrible acts, but tried to argue diminished responsibility, pointing to a supposed history of childhood trauma and obsessive tendencies. But their words felt hollow in the face of the mountain of evidence. Witnesses began to testify. Officer Michael Sullivan, who had discovered Emily's abandoned bike in 2007, recalled the eerie silence of Maple Street, the pink handlebars leaning against a fire hydrant, the juice box and granola bars still untouched. His voice cracked as he admitted he had hoped, even then, that she had simply wandered off. Detective Janet Morrison, now retired, spoke of the endless nights combing through files, the frustration of dead ends, the way Emily's case had defined her career. When she described seeing the Polaroids for the first time, the courtroom fell silent, the weight of her words sinking into every heart present. Dr. Patricia Hoffman testified next, her clinical detachment tested by the nature of her findings. She described the container, the condition of the photographs, the deliberate care in their preservation. She avoided graphic detail, but her words painted enough of a picture to send shudders through the courtroom. Jurors covered their mouths. Some wept openly. Sarah Carter lowered her eyes, gripping David's hand tightly. Then came Rebecca Martinez, the FBI specialist whose enhancements had revealed the reflection in the mirror. She explained the process in painstaking detail. How each pixel had been magnified, how patterns invisible to the human eye revealed the outline of a badge, the sleeve of a uniform. She showed the jury the enhanced images, pointing to the clues that had led them to Elm Street. The jurors leaned closer, some shaking their heads in disbelief at the precision of the analysis. For many, it was the first time they realized how science had unraveled what instinct and intuition alone could not. When the prosecution presented the physical evidence recovered from Weber's basement, the courtroom air grew thick with unease. Photographs of the wood paneling, the windows, the false wall concealing trophies, luminol tests glowing faint blue against the floorboards where blood had once been. Strands of blonde hair lifted from cracks, matched by DNA to Emily Carter. And then, the belongings, small items taken from Emily and other children, ordinary objects transformed into haunting relics. A notebook with cursive letters, a toy bracelet, a pair of shoes. Each item was catalogued, tagged and displayed. For the Carter family, it was like watching pieces of their daughter's life stripped of innocence and turned into evidence. The prosecution's most damning evidence was Weber's own confession. The recordings were played in court, his monotone voice filling the room. He spoke of experiments, of keeping Emily alive for days, of documenting her suffering. His words were chilling not for their drama, but for their calm detachment. As the audio played, Sarah pressed the framed photograph of Emily against her chest, her body rocking slightly, as though to shield her daughter even now. David stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, his hands trembling. Jurors looked pale, their faces betraying disgust and sorrow in equal measure. The defense attempted to cross-examine, to suggest coercion in Weber's confession, but the sheer volume of corroborating evidence made their arguments hollow. Mental illness could not explain the meticulous preservation of photographs, the deliberate concealment of evidence, the calculated choice of victims. This was not compulsion, this was control. After weeks of testimony, closing arguments were delivered. The prosecutor spoke with fire, reminding the jury of Emily's note on the refrigerator, of her pink bicycle, of her laughter that once filled a quiet cul-de-sac. He pointed at Weber and said, "This man stole her life, documented her suffering, and then walked freely among us for 12 years. Justice may be delayed, but it cannot be denied." The defense's closing was brief, almost perfunctory. By then, even they seemed to sense the futility of their cause. Deliberations lasted less than 6 hours. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. The sentencing phase was swift. Life imprisonment without parole. Some in the courtroom wept in relief. Others shook with anger. wishing for a punishment more severe. But the law had spoken. Thomas Weber would die behind bars, stripped of the quiet life he had built upon the ashes of children's lives. When the sentence was read, Sarah Carter did not cry. She closed her eyes and whispered something only she could hear. Later she would say it was a promise to Emily, that she would carry her memory forward, that she would not let the world define her by her final days, but by the 10 years she had lived in joy and innocence. David placed his arm gently around Sarah's shoulders, the gesture of a father who, despite everything, remained bound to the child they had lost. Outside the courthouse, the community gathered in vigil once more. Hundreds of candles lit the steps, their flames swaying in the winter wind. Parents held their children close, neighbors embraced. Strangers wept together. For boys the verdict was not an end but a turning point. Safety could never again be taken for granted. But neither would Emily's story be forgotten. In the years that followed, her legacy shaped boys in profound ways. Roosevelt Elementary expanded its memorial garden, dedicating a butterfly sculpture to Emily's memory. The city established the Carter Foundation, funding programs for child safety and supporting families of missing children. Sarah became a national advocate, speaking at conferences, urging lawmakers to strengthen background checks and support investigative resources. Her grief became her mission, her daughter's name a banner she carried into every fight for change. Detective Sullivan retired not long after the trial, the weight of Emily's case etched permanently into his life. He admitted he sometimes still dreamed of Maple Street, of the bicycle leaning silent against the hydrant, of the box buried in dirt for 12 long years. But he also spoke of Emily's resilience, not in life but in legacy. She changed how we see the world. He said at his retirement ceremony, "Her story will protect others. That's her justice." For boys, time moved forward, as it always does. New families moved in, children grew up, laughter returned to neighborhoods. But beneath the surface the city carried a scar, a reminder that even in the most ordinary places, each July 15th candles still flickered in Veterans Park, some years many, some years few. Sarah always attended, her voice steady as she spoke of her daughter, her eyes lifted toward the purple flowers planted in Emily's honor. Emily Carter never came home, but her story lived on, in the laws rewritten, in the gardens tended, in the parents who now trusted their instincts, who spoke up when something felt wrong. Her absence became a presence, a reminder etched into the collective memory of a city that had once believed it was safe. And for those who listened, who carried her story forward, Emily Carter became more than a tragedy. She became a call to vigilance, a plea for compassion, and a reminder that every child deserves to ride their bicycle home.